afternoon, everyone. I would first like to thank the organizers for the invitation to present my work here. I'm really honored to be able to show you some of our results looking at the effects of social context on learning and the neuromechanisms of learning. I'm Berna. I'm working at Leiden University in the Netherlands in the Brain and Guroglu Research Center. And so in this study, we wanted to focus on the effects of the social context when young people are in a learning environment and how that influences neural processes. So in the next 50 minutes, I'm going to try to show you that the social context modulates the neural responses that we have for feedback, and that the social context effect is further modulated by age. When we talk about learning, I think the majority of learning takes place in a highly social context. When you look at young children, they often learn from their parents or maybe older siblings at home. And once they start going to school, they're in a highly social context surrounded by their peers and friends. Now, across adolescence, we know that the peer context becomes increasingly more significant. And maybe I don't need to come up with research findings to convince you about this. You can think about your own youth, maybe you have kids around you. We as adults send young people to school, and we think the main goal is to learn, right? For adolescents, very often one of the main goals is to interact with their peers. So the rewards that they get from the social interactions may even be more important for young people than what we think should be the main goal of school environment, that is learning. So this social context can also be highly distracting for young people when they're with their peers. And in recent years, there's a lot of neuroimaging research looking at the neural correlates of social interactions, what happens in the brain when you're interacting with your friends, for example. And there's increasingly more evidence that one of the brain regions that's involved in social interactions, particularly with peers and friends, is the striatum that's been shown to be important for reward processing. Now, for the rest of my talk, I'm not going to talk about the striatum today, but I just want to emphasize the underlying idea that if striatum is involved in social interactions, and we know that striatum is also involved in learning processes, it might be possible to use the social environment as a positive source of maybe motivation for individuals, for young people to learn even better, rather than the social context being just a distraction for them, and then focusing on the social interactions and not learning as well as they learn. So far there are many studies that look at, particularly if we're talking about the fMRI studies that look at the neural underpinnings of learning. Many of these studies have looked at the individual in a learning context, and this is somewhat also inherent to the fact that fMRI studies use a scanner, and when we want to look at learning and the neural mechanisms involved in learning, you have an individual lying in a scanner alone somewhere. So it's also challenging to investigate how the social context might influence the neural mechanisms involved in learning. So we already have some ideas about the brain regions that are involved in learning processes, but like I said, these mostly look at the individual context of one person trying to use feedback in order to learn whatever the task requires them to learn. So in this study, we wanted to move from the individual context and try to incorporate the social context and to see how that influences the neural mechanisms of learning. I'm going to talk about today particularly on feedback processing. So feedback processing refers to the idea that when you perform a task, you have behavioral output, you get feedback on your behavioral output, whether that's positive or negative, so you've done something well, you get positive reinforcement, or you get to see that you've made an error. So you use this feedback to improve your next behavior, and that is involved in actually the learning process. So I will be looking at feedback processing and not necessarily the behavior or the neuromechanisms involved in the behavior per se, but what happens when you're receiving feedback that is positive or negative on your performance. So one important aspect of how we incorporated the social context in this task is by looking at performance that can, on one hand, have consequences for yourself, and I will refer to this as the individual context. This is also similar to how previous studies have looked at learning. So you are an individual, you're performing a task, and the consequences very often in these tasks have, your performance has consequences for yourself. So if you do well, you can maybe earn some points. If you do not do well, you can lose some points. In our task, we incorporated others in the sense that the individual could perform the task so that it has consequences also for someone else. Yeah? So that person could also be a friend. I will try to focus on two simple research questions because the task, as you will see in a bit, is actually more complex than that. But I will look at the role of the social context in the sense that there are shared goals. So your performance does not have only consequences for yourself, but also for someone else. That is the social context that I will refer to. And so what effect does the social context have on feedback processing? And does this hold across different age groups across adolescence? So in our study, we had a total of 85 participants divided into 3 age groups. I will refer to them as the pre-adolescents, early adolescents, mid-adolescents. The pre-adolescents were aged between 9 and 12. The mean age was towards the higher end, so they were about 11 years old. And we had slightly more males, about 60% was male, 40% was females in this age group. Then we had 12 to 14-year-olds with a mean age of 13. And they were approximately evenly distributed, males and females. And we had 15 to 7-year-olds with a mean age of 16 and approximately 20 to 30 participants in each age group. What we did was we asked participants to come to the scanning session together with their best friends. So we had every participant come in with their best friends. And when they came to the session, they also met another peer. And these were Confederates. We contacted theater schools in the area, and we had age-matched young actors come in and act as Confederates. We told them that they're going to engage in in a task where their peers are also going to be playing and watching them. And so this is the neutral peer in our study. We were also interested to see if the effects that we find, if that holds for specifically for the best friend, or if it would also hold for any other peer. And then when the participants laid in the scanner, they played a task that's called a cannonball task, and I will explain how that goes. In the cannonball task, they have a cannon, I will illustrate this in a bit, but they have this cannon that's moving here on the x-axis, and they have a target that they are expected to stop the cannon as it's moving right below the target. And if they can do that, then they earn points. And if they do well, they see a thumbs up that they did well. And when they stop the cannon, if it's not aligned with the target, then they get a thumbs down to see that they did not do well. Across the task, we programmed the task so that it would, for every individual, get more difficult if they did well, so that we could ensure the same percentage of positive and negative feedback across participants. That's also an important part of the task that I'm not interested in the behavioral output, if they do well or not, because the task was adjusted for each individual, so they did make some mistakes, so that we did not have some individuals that they kept on doing very well. So the cannon would get smaller if they were doing really well. So here you can see you have the cannon moving, and then you stop it. If it aligns with the target, then you get some points. And then it could be, the position of the target would be changing on every trial, and like I said, it would also be getting smaller. And this is a thumbs up, or then you would get thumbs down if you did not do well. So we had 3 conditions in the task. One is the individual condition, and we told the participants that when they played the individual condition, no one could see them, and whether they did well or not had only consequences for themselves. In contrast to the social context, and in the social context they would be playing with a friend, and they were told that when they played with a friend, their friend would also be seeing if they did well, and if they did well or not had also influences on the outcome for the friend, so that's the shared consequences. And the same thing on some trials, they would be playing with a neutral peer, that's the competitor that they met at the beginning of the study. Also important to say that in the design of the task, so they did 20 trials of themselves playing, that's the individual context I will refer to, and in the context that they were playing with another peer, also to increase the believability of the task, we had blocks of them playing and then them seeing their friend play. So I will not get in my results into the details of that, but they played sometimes, and then for 10 trials, and then they would also see their friend play, and when their friend played, they also knew that whether their friend does well or not had consequences for them. I will focus only on the play blocks, because that's similar to the individual context where they would be also playing. So the only difference is that you're playing on your own, the consequences hold only for you, versus you're playing also for another peer. That peer could be a friend or a neutral peer, and so your behavior has consequences for someone else as well. I will jump immediately into the results. So we found an effect in the lateral prefrontal cortex for the social context. There was higher levels of activation during feedback processing in the social context for the friend as well as the neutral. These did not differ from one another, and it was higher than the individual context. So when adolescents play the task, and we're looking at the moment of feedback processing, right? Not when they're playing, but when they see feedback on how they have done. If they were playing it for someone else as well, there was higher levels of activity in the lateral prefrontal cortex. And this brain region is important for behavior regulation or executive functioning, so there was high levels of activation in this region for the social context compared to the individual context. And similarly, there was high levels of activation also in the posterior superior temporal sulcus, that's the PSES. And this region has been shown in a wide range of tasks to be more involved or more active in social tasks that involve some form of maybe perspective taking or theory of mind related tasks. So tasks that involve the social cognition are shown to involve activation in this more posterior brain region. So similar to the lateral prefrontal cortex, there was again higher levels of activation in this brain region when they played with a friend or a neutral peer compared to when they played the task themselves. So these are the social context effects I wanted to show you. Now I want to show you one finding regarding the age differences that we find. And so we find differences in the medial prefrontal cortex, posterior medial prefrontal cortex, for the early adolescents, so 13-year-olds, in the social context compared to the individual context. So what you see in the graph here is the difference in activation levels for friend versus individual or neutral versus individual, so the social context compared to the individual context. There was higher levels of activity in this area for the social context compared to the individual context, specifically for the 13-year-olds. And these bar graphs, they don't really differ from zero. So for the younger and older adolescents, feedback processing didn't engage the medial prefrontal cortex in a different way for the social versus the individual context. So the higher MPFC activation for the social context is specifically there for the early adolescents, for 13-year-olds. So summing up our results, we show that feedback on performance that has consequences for others, so in a social context, involves higher activation of brain regions that are involved in behavior regulation, like the lateral prefrontal cortex, and it also involved in social cognition, like the PSES. And specifically for early adolescence, we find that there is a distinction between the social and the individual context in terms of activation in the medial prefrontal cortex. And I should add here that although it's a bit of a posterior region of the medial prefrontal cortex, there are also findings that show that such dorsal parts of the medial prefrontal cortex are more involved in thinking of others or perspective-taking related tasks compared to tasks that involve the self. Interestingly, and that's not what we specifically expected, we find really that our results in general hold for friends as well as for mutual peers. I had expected that there might be especially age differences in terms of the roles of friends, specifically maybe for early to mid-adolescence, but so far in our data we do not find results to back that up. But the general peer context seems to engage higher activation levels during feedback processing. And in terms of implications, I think these results suggest that the social context modulates feedback processing and how feedback is processed in the brain, and that early adolescents might be specifically more sensitive to the social context effects during learning. I want to end by thanking my colleagues from the Brain and Development Research Center in Leiden, but also definitely participants, parents, as well as the theater schools that are involved in the study, and specifically Afke Snelting and Doreen van Hoorn for data collection, Sandy Overgouw for support on data analyses, and Ellen de Bruin for being involved in all stages of the data and our funding scientific organization for the funding. And thank you for your attention.
Any questions?
Hi, thank you. It was really interesting. I was wondering about the implications for learning that you just mentioned, because the task you did was not actually a learning task, right? So I'm not very familiar with the role of feedback in this. So I was wondering if you could just share some of your reasonings behind you think this may have an effect in learning.
Yeah. Well, the reason why we specifically chose this task was to kind of keep it simple as a starting point. We know that feedback processing influences learning, so the way you process feedback, I would expect it to have implications for how well you can learn eventually from that feedback. So the next step would be to look at processes that are specifically involved in learning, where you also would have some behavioral output, and whether the similar brain regions are involved and the social context is, influences learning on that as well. So I cannot say something about whether these effects will actually hold, but that would be my expectation, because we show that at least the neural mechanisms involved in processing feedback is different. So I would expect as a next step that it would also have influences on actually learning behavior.
Hi, Berna. Thank you for this nice talk. My question is related actually, so about applications for education. So it's probably too early to really say something about that, but so you're saying your results suggest that social context is influencing learning. So what are your thoughts on how education could use that, like for example for learning together with peers or giving peer feedback or in that direction?
Yeah. I think that's also where I would want to head to with these findings. I'm really intrigued by the age finding, for example, that we find in the medial prefrontal cortex for early adolescence. And as I mentioned at the start of my talk, the social context might be distracting, so have negative influences on learning, but it can also have motivational influences on learning. And I think that these effects might also be age different. So for very practical implications, I believe many teachers are faced with, for example, do you let kids pair up in teams to do a certain task? Do they learn well from that? Or should they better perform a task on their own? Will they learn better from that? And if you pair them up, should you pair them up with best friends? Is that really motivating? It could be. but it can also be more motivating for a certain age group to do that with your friend, whereas for another age group it might be distracting to do the task with your best friend. So you might be better for specific age groups. Say, I'm going to match kids who don't really have social interactions with one another or not best friends with one another in the class. So I'm thinking of these kinds of implications, and the crucial next step is to see if the social context effects actually hold also for learning behavior, and if we find such age differences that I expect.
Hi, thanks. I was wondering how you interpret the huge visual effects that you found, the visual block that was in one of your pictures. You didn't talk about that one. What's the difference there? They see different things.
To be honest, I don't know. They don't see really different things. So one different thing that they see is in the individual context, they have just play trials one after another, whereas in the social context, they switch between trials of playing and observing. And when they switch, they have text. Although this was modeled separately in the fMRI analyses, I'm thinking if the effects that I see is actually related to that visual difference in the social context, because they see a text that they need to switch to observation and then switch back to play. And now I specifically looked at the play blocks, but I'm thinking if there's some carryover effects related to that in terms of visual. Other than that, they don't see anything different.
Yeah, we have a similar thing on our first studies.
Yeah, and
it could be a top-down effect maybe as well, that I wouldn't know why,
yeah,
things would be different with visual things.
I don't have a very...
So it's interesting to know when it happens in more studies, because it would be interesting to further.
Yeah, yes, definitely. So that's one specific thing in our study that's different for the individual and the social context. Yeah. Yes.
Two things. One, you mentioned in the introduction that you were interested in striatum. So did you see any changes in striatum? And then just curious, were the two collaborators allowed to communicate with each other? Were they encouraging each other? And was there some kind of verbal interaction on top of the visual presentation?
So I'll start with your second question. In terms of the task, they were not allowed to communicate with one another, and actually, they did not actually see each other play, because so when they observed, we tried to simulate in terms of behavior, their own behavior, so that when we look at the play versus observe contrast, which I didn't get into, that we could keep that also in very similar ways. So they did, so their friends did not actually watch them, and they did not actually see their friends play. So they go into scanner thinking that this is going to happen, and they definitely believed it because their best friend was there and they had a confederate who they believed is actually there. But once they lie in the scanner, they were not communicating with one another, they just like play the task themselves. Second question, the striatum. I do find effects in the striatum for the social context. So striatum is more active for social context versus individual context. I do not yet find any specific effects for the friend, so it holds again in a similar way for the friend as well as for the neutral peer, and no age effects in there either.